Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of May of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates and details, so let's start. And the most important things, the most important events are coming of course from Kharkiv direction. As you can see, we have adjusted the map showing additional control of the armed forces of Russian Federation. There are two areas that we colored in red. This is the western flank, let's call it like this, of Kharkiv offensive operation, and this is the eastern flank of Russian offensive operation. I believe that you follow different mappers, different analytics, and most of them have also adjusted their maps, and we see significant Russian progress, but it is very important to understand the details about the Kharkiv offensive operation, and we need to understand the base and the reason why most of the mappers have adjusted their maps. We made, the military summary team made our own analysis about the situation, and we classified the ways of the Russian progress, or at least the changes on map, in 4 or 5 different groups. The first one, of course, as usually, we've adjusted the map based on the geolocations we received. And during the previous 24 hours, we got few geolocations that confirms the Russian progress, at least over the village by the name of Pylna. On this video, we can see the Ukrainian forces, more precisely the forces of the 42nd Mechanized Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, were FPV droning the Russian forces right on the southern outskirts of the village, which is 100% confirmation of Russian control over the territory. Most of those armored vehicles were abandoned by the Russians. Most likely the Russians captured and established control over this tree line, over these gardens, and they abandoned their armored vehicles, and then the Ukrainians of the 42nd Mechanized destroyed. And we have another video of how the Russians were trying to cross the border, and most likely they managed to do. Also, the Russians abandoned their armored vehicles, and after that another Ukraine FPV drone operator squad destroyed the Russian personnel carriers with FPV drone strikes. So based on those videos, that was, let's say, not like the fresh videos. Most likely those attacks took place even yesterday or something like this, but this is the evidence we have about the real geolocated Russian control. The next group of Russian control of the area colored is the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Today, as we discussed yesterday, we were expecting the report of the Ministry of Defense, and the Russians published the report. The report was very interesting. The Russians are saying that as a result of offensive operation, the units of the Sever group of forces have established complete control over the villages like Borisovka, Огурцово, Pletinovka, Pylnaya, and Strelechina. So that was official statement of the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. If we move back on map, we can, let's say, discuss the towns. So this is the first town, Borisovka, that was mentioned in the Ministry of Defense report. Then Огурцово, this is the village by the name of Огурцово. This is it, the village that located to the south of Novotavlazhanka and to the northwest of Vovchansk. We have the city by the name of Pletenovka. This is the, let's say, it's village that located on the border, let's say, between Russian territory and Ukrainian territory. And we have the village by the name of Strelechna. This is the village by the name of Strelechna, and if you remember yesterday when we were talking about the Kharkiv offensive operation, that village was the first that was announced by different sources that the village was captured by the Russian forces. But as you can see, we have a much bigger progress of the armored forces of Russian Federation, and now we're going to discuss the third, let's say, type of the, let's say, evidence confirming the Russian progress on the area that most of the mappers were using for adjusting their own maps. And we are talking the official statement of the units of group of forces North, Sever. So the Russians, as you know, almost every single squad, brigade in Russia, either in Russian or Ukrainian, have their own Telegram channel or a Facebook channel or Twitter X channel, and they publish some information there. And the Russian, let's say, group of forces North has also their own Telegram channel where they made their own statement about the results of clashes on the 11th of May. And according to them, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Krasnaya, Markhavets, and Oleynikova. So if we turn back on map, according to the, let's say, official statement of the group of forces North, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Krasnaya, Markhavets, and Oleynikova. So these are additional 3 towns that were captured by the Russians. Also, they're added that in Vovchansk direction, the assault groups established complete control over the village by the name of Gatishina. So let's move to Vovchansk direction. This is Vovchansk direction, and this is the village by the name of Gatishina. This is it. Gatishna, this is it. So this village was captured according to Group of North. This Agurtsovo was captured according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. And if we continue with the statement, there was another very important report that, according to information we have, the Russians also gained a foothold on the northwest outskirts of Staritsa. So this is the village by the name of Staritsa. This is it. And the Russians also launched an offensive operation on the line Murom, then the borderline, forest, and by bypassing forest, the Russians reached the outskirts of the village by the name of Staritsa. So let's add some arrows on map, which will give us a better understanding of that offensive operation. So this is it. And this is very important because now the Russians are going to move further to Staritsa, and the main purpose of this attack, of course, is to establish complete control over this bridge, this one that Ukrainian used to supply and support their forces in Vovchansk. We will talk a lot about the logistic with Vovchansk because the Russians, as I understand, are trying to encircle Vovchansk and to create Vovchansk cauldron. So let's summarize from the beginning. The first things we were talking about were the videos of geolocations. The second thing was the Ministry of Defense report. The third thing we were talking about was the report of the Group of Forces North, and all those reports report about significant Russian progress on the western and on the eastern flank. Now let's talk about another important thing. Besides these four sources of Russian progress, we have the fourth one, and this is, as usually, the rumors and talks about the situation on the ground. And for example, the Russian military expert Ryber, for example, stated that the Russians also managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and the border on the line between the village by the name of Kudiivka and the village on the Russian territory by the name of Zhuravlyovka. So the Russians launched this offensive operation as well and to establish complete control over this territory. For now, neither Ministry of Defense nor the, let's say, Telegram channel or official office of the Group of Forces North confirmed this information, but I just think that we should discuss this information as well. Furthermore, other sources reported that the Russians managed to move further to the south and that there were heavy clashes in the village by the name of Gluboka, and that the Russians managed to establish complete control, or at least to answer the village. I believe that, and most likely the Russians were talking about the farms that located to the north of this water barrier. I don't think that the Russians managed to bypass and to answer the southern part of Glubokolo due to some geographical issues, of course. Furthermore, the other Russian sources reported that there was another offensive operation on the line Sereda-Zelena, and that the Russians, as a result of offensive, established complete control over this village as well. So that was another wave of attack. So we see that now from this direction, from the western flank, we can see more or less like understandable picture of what the Russians are planning to do next. Now let's move to Vovchansk, and when talking about this territory, there is just one area of unconfirmed Russian progress that we have discussed in the previous update, and according to information we have, the Russians on the line between Marina and Zybina established complete control over the village of Zybina. This is it. So if we summarize everything, let's add some gray zone, and this is the territory that maybe the Russians also managed to establish complete control over during the previous 24 hours. So now this is the full picture of all updates we have: official statements, video geolocations, the statements of the Group of Forces North, and about the rumors on the ground. Furthermore, the most very we can't say like very unreliable, we can say that the sources that doesn't have any credibility also stated that the Russians started their movements in direction of Ternova. So this is it. For now, we are not going to adjust the map because this source doesn't have like 100%, let's say, credibility of his information. And the same source reported that the main Russian goal of attack in direction of Zybina is to move further to the east in direction of Volokhovka, then to Karachayna, and then with a very fast attack in direction of Bely Kolodys. So this is like the main goal of the Russian forces, of the movements of the Russian forces in the vicinity of Zybina. Very difficult to understand how the Russians are going to bypass these territories deep inside the Ukrainian territory, but who knows what might happen tomorrow, because everything can't be predicted by anybody. Also, we have some evidence of fire anomalies, and most of the fire anomalies confirms the situation that we've just discussed, the Russian movements along Seversky Donetsk River and the Russian movements in direction of Lipsy on the west and Seversky Donetsk on the east. Now let's move to another important topic, the plans, what the Russians are going to do, what the Russians are planning to do, and what the Russians have already achieved of those plans they established in front of them. First of all, of course, we understand that the main target for the Russians is two towns, the town by the name of Vovchansk and the town by the name of Lipsy. When talking about Lipsy, the Russians are still too far from the area, and there are still very heavy clashes are going to take place before the Russians reach the outskirts of the village. But when talking about Vovchansk, we can make a conclusion that Vovchansk is already semi-encircled or semi-surrounded, at least from three directions, from the west, from the north, and maybe from the east and the southeast. Now let's talk in details. During the previous 24 hours, we have already discussed this video. The Russians destroyed the dam. They not damaged, they destroyed the dam that connected Kharkiv with Vovchansk. So this is one of the damage, one of the strike that the Russians conduct on the Ukrainian, let's say, logistic and support in the northern direction. Of course, this strike, let's say, doesn't, collapse the logistic in this area for 100%, but at least the damage was very powerful. Now the Ukrainians need to think how to, let's say, improve their positions and how to secure the reinforcements and reserves and supply of Vovchansk defense belt and Vovchansk garrison. Furthermore, today we got a very interesting video from the village by the name of Tikha. This village is located to the east of Vovchansk and to the south of the Russian border, and we have the video how the Russians destroyed another bridge on this direction. So as a result of most likely of Krasnopol or maybe another missile, it's very difficult to understand from this angle, the Russians destroyed another bridge that located to the east of Vovchansk. This is not like a very big bridge, but obviously this bridge the Ukrainians were using to supply and support their forces in Tikha, and maybe the Ukrainians were using this bridge to send reinforcements to the town by the name of Zybino, which was captured by the Russians. Furthermore, I'll remind you that just yesterday we were talking that the Russians destroyed another bridge in the vicinity of Zybino. This one, we have even geolocation, and the video was geolocated, and this is an explosion. So if we summarize everything based on the geolocation we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours destroyed at least three main important logistic bridges on Vovchansk direction. So the first bridge, the second bridge, and the southern bridge along the water reservoir on Seversky Donetsk Donbass River. So if we summarize everything, let's say maybe 50% of support of Vovchansk was already cut off by the Russians. And now it's very important to understand the real, let's say, plans and the real goals of the Russians in Staritsa, because if we summarize everything and if we continue moving, if we continue moving the arrow further to Staritsa, and if the Russians are able to get this line and to establish complete control over this territory, then by this attack the Russians will be able to cut this bridge, as we discussed just a few minutes ago. This bridge will be cut off from the mainland, and the Ukrainians in Vovchansk will lose another supply road. So then the Ukrainians will have probably a few pontoon bridges along this river, somewhere in the vicinity of Rubizhnoye, Verkhnya Pisarevka, but obviously this is not going to be enough to support and supply such a big garrison that is currently located in the area of Vovchansk. Furthermore, I'll remind you that maybe you don't know that Tikha, this area, is located on the hill. It's the highest area around Vovchansk, and if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this hill, then the Russians will be able to see everything in Vovchansk as, let's say, in front of them without any barriers. From Tikha, from this hill, they will be able to control everything, movements, redeployments, and Vovchansk, we can start counting days when the town falls. So the situation for the Ukrainians is very critical. The Russians are bombing this territory heavily with significant number of aviation bombs with CAVs, FABs, artillery, missiles, and so on. The Ukrainians still show some resistance to the Russians, but already, let's say, but at 9 p.m. of the local time, the Russian sources start reporting that the Ukrainians began evacuating their forces from Vovchansk further to the south in direction of Kharkiv and the mainland. So I think that the battle for Vovchansk is already lost by the Ukrainians, and it's just days, few days, maybe weeks, when the Russians will bypass this area and will move further to the south. us. So this is the situation. Another important thing that I would like to discuss with you, a few more details about the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation report. The Russians also captured around 34 Ukrainian prisoners of war, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians destroyed one Vampire multiple launch rocket system, one French Caesar. The Russians destroyed one Bogdanov, 4 D-20 howitzers, one D-30 howitzer, so significant number of artillery, and most of them were geolocated, and we have some videos. For example, this is Bogdana that was destroyed according to the Ministry of Defense report. This artillery system was destroyed by Lancet strike. So when I was watching all these videos with destroyed Ukraine artillery systems, with destroyed bridge, with destroyed, for example, this air defense system Buk M1, as you can see, this system was just arrived in the area, not, let's say, 2 months ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 days ago. It was arrived just now, right at the moment when the Russians launched their offensive, and this air defense system was completely destroyed. On this video we can see another Vampire system that was sent by the Ukrainians to the line of combat contact to attack the Russian territory, and most likely this Vampire system was attacking Belgorod, the capital of Belgorod, the capital of Belgorod region, and then Ukrainians tried to hide this system, but it was destroyed by Iskander strike. Furthermore, we got a lot of updates that the Ukrainians were bombing Belgorod heavily, lots of explosions. But when talking about all these, let's say, destroyed artillery system, one thing comes to my mind: the Ukrainians weren't completely prepared, were completely unprepared to this Russian offensive. When the Russians started, they start sending air defense without any protection, without any support, without anything. They were just sending with one purpose: not to counter artillery systems, but even if artillery system can strike just once, it's better to strike once than not to strike at all. When I was watching all this video, it was like things that came to my mind. The Ukrainians completely wasn't prepared to this situation, and there is a panic, lots of problems, and we see that Ukrainians still can't find a solution how to stabilize the line of combat contact. Lots of prisoners of war that we discussed, and another important thing that we should discuss, because the Russians started an unexpected attack. Most likely, if you remember, according to the previous statements, according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, according to MI6, according to Institute of Study of War, the Western countries were saying that the Russians are planning to start offensive operation after 15th of May, not on the 10th of May, right after the let's say 12 p.m. and the Russians 12 a.m. and the Russians launched an offensive. The Russians started too early. The Western countries as well as Ukrainians didn't expect such a powerful attack. So that's why we can make a conclusion that the situation is very critical for the Ukrainians, and now everything depends on one factor from the Ukrainian side: the forces of Ukraine, armed forces of Ukraine, who will let's say face the first waves of Russian attack. If these forces are able to stop the Russians, don't forget that they don't have equipment, they don't have a lot of armored vehicles, they don't have proper supply. If they are able to stop the Russians mainly by their own bodies, then the Ukraine itself will be able to hold Kharkiv as long as possible. So now let's talk who is responsible from the Ukrainian side for defense of Kharkiv direction, and let's discuss the story of these brigades. According to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, Russian troops have defeated manpower and hardware of 23rd Mechanized, 43rd Mechanized Brigade, 120th and 125th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. So what are these brigades and where we could see them before? For example, when talking about 23rd Mechanized Brigade, this brigade used to be located in the vicinity of Очеретино. So 23rd Mechanized Brigade with in the pair with 115th Mechanized Brigade were responsible for protection of the bridgehead around of Очеретино itself, Arkhangelsk, Novokalinovo, Keramik. All these towns were under responsibility of 115th and 23rd Mechanized Brigade. And now we see that most likely because the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy 23rd Brigade to Kharkiv because the Ukrainians had some information about the further Russian plans, the defense belt in Cheretina collapsed. So maybe because of that. Furthermore, this brigade was very, very damaged during the battle for Cheretina. So this brigade was redeployed to Kharkiv not fully blooded, maybe half blooded or even worse. Furthermore, the 2nd Brigade, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported, is the forces of 43rd Mechanized Brigade, who, according to the most of the mappers who, let's say, makes all these changes of units on the map, was located in the vicinity of Kislovka-Kotlarovka. And the thing is that the Ukrainians redeployed the 43rd Brigade to Kharkiv, and I'll remind you that just a week ago the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt in Kislovka-Kotlarovka, and most likely due to the thing that Ukrainians redeployed the 43rd Brigade to Kharkiv, and they, let's say, put the responsibility of this area on the shoulders of some territory defense brigade who wasn't prepared for clashes on this direction. So most likely the collapse of Kupiansk direction was because of Ukrainian redeployment of the core of brigade of the 43rd Brigade in direction of Kharkiv. Another few brigades is 125th Brigade. This is the veterans, this is the old brigade that is located on the Kupiansk area probably since the creation of this front line. So as I understand, this is the most experienced forces on the direction, 125th Territory Defense Brigade. And the last brigade that is responsible for the protection, as I understand, is the forces of 120th Brigade, and according to information from the open source, this brigade was redeployed from the border with Belarus. So they are completely unprepared, and as I understand, they don't know what to do with even guns and, let's say, weapon, because their main job was to protect the border with Belarus, where we saw no clashes during the previous, let's say, year of let's say special military operation. But there is another important thing, and I'm talking about this video. For example, on this video that was published by the Ukrainians, we can see the strikes of FPV drones by the 42nd Mechanized Brigade that wasn't included into the Ministry of Defense report. So we can make a conclusion that either the Ministry of Defense report made a mistake by calling 42nd Brigade by 43rd Brigade, or there are two Mechanized Brigade, 42nd and 43rd. And when talking about 42nd Brigade, just a month ago, this brigade was located on the eastern part of Chasiv Yar, and this brigade mainly was responsible for protection of such positions like Bogdanovka, Popovo Forest, New Cemetery, the northeastern outskirts and the fields of Ivanovska, where almost months or even 2 months ago this brigade was completely defeated by the Russians, had significant losses. This brigade was removed from the line of combat contact for replacements, for restoring of its combat capabilities, and now we see this half-blooded brigade on Kharkiv direction. So to summarize everything, as I see, most of the brigades on Kharkiv direction are completely not ready for fighting with the real well-trained Russian army, fully equipped with significant number of different types of weapon, which is much more better than Ukrainian one. The only brigade that can show at least anything on this direction is 125th and 43rd Brigade from Kupiansk direction, but they were redeployed so fast that redeployment led to complete collapse of those defense belts. So it's even difficult to imagine the chaos that currently is taking place in Kharkiv and Kupiansk area. I tried to explain everything that I managed to summarize during the previous few days, and now it's up to you. And of course, it's very important to understand the Kharkiv offensive from the beginning, and I hope that this short analysis help you to understand the situation from the beginning, and now it's going to be much more easier for you to understand the next Russian movements, the next Russian plans and goals on this direction. And according to understanding of the situation, I see that maybe the Russians will be able to capture significant square kilometers of the territory, but not just 110 that was today reported by the group of forces north. Now let's move to the line of combat contact. We have additional updates from every single front line, and the most important updates are coming from of course, Avdiivka direction, where the Russians continue offensive operation. We have some adjustments on map. The Russians managed to get as close as possible to Umanska itself from the south. We have additional geolocations. The Russians managed to the Ukrainian defense belt around Nitailova, Pervomayska, Umanska collapsed by the Russians. The Russians captured the fields between the villages. The Ukrainians start abandoning process. They're running away through the fields trying to save their lives, and the Russians are moving further for them. We have reports that the Russians entered the farms on the southern part of, let's say, Nitailova, and currently the Russians are fighting for the final streets, final square meters of the village, and most likely during the next few days the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will announce about complete control over this village. We haven't received anything from, let's say, Krasnogorovka important when talking about geolocations. Just one source reported that the Russians established complete control over the park that located in the central part, and if this information confirmed, then we can say that Krasnogorovka is already collapsed, and the Ukrainians, few groups maybe were already encircled by the Russians. We have significant artillery duels in the south and Donetsk direction. Significant number of artillery systems of the armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed just during the previous 24 hours, as well as on the northern direction in Kharkiv. The same story in south Donetsk direction. Significant number of artillery systems as a result of counter-artillery duels were basically destroyed without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. So another area with a very poor situation for the Ukrainians. We have a very interesting video from Zaporozhye direction. The Russians managed to discover the small airfield for Ukrainian helicopters, and as a result of Iskander strike, the Ukrainians lost up to 3 helicopters, 2 Mi-24 and 1 Mi-8 was damaged or maybe also destroyed. For example, in this video we can see the consequences, the fires, the consequences of Russian strikes in the area. A little bit further to Zaporozhye, we got another video how the Russians managed to discover the ammo depot of air defense systems from the armed forces of Ukraine, and as a result of Iskander strike, that system was also destroyed. So the Russians, as you can see, continue hunting for the Ukraine air defense. Just a day ago we were talking about destroyed Patriot system, now another Buk system, we have helicopters destroyed. So everything reminds us that the Russians did a very great job with reconnaissance. The previous 3 months the Russians managed to collect significant number of very important information about position of everything, and now they're just working out everything, and this led to significant progress and significant results. And the most important update from Kherson direction is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, or how to say, the battle for islands, managed to restore control over the island that Syrsky, the head of Ukraine army, captured 2 weeks ago. The Russians raised the flag in the middle of the island that confirms complete control over the territory by the Russian forces. So some let's say analytics, some sources reported and says that the previous 24 hours were the worst 24 hours for Ukraine, and it's very difficult to understand what the Ukrainians are going to do. Furthermore, we got reports that United Kingdom announced the biggest military help to Ukraine with significant number of missiles, up to 1,600, and all these things, all these reports tell us that it's like a panic and it's like a disaster, and it's like desperate actions from the Western countries trying to stabilize the situation at least a little bit, because as I understand, neither Ukrainians nor the Western countries did expect that the Russians can achieve such a significant results just for 36 hours of clashes on the border with Kharkiv. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.